Good evening and welcome to Classics for All, the annual Moot. I welcome everyone who is here in this courtroom, and I also welcome the much larger number of people who are watching this event online. In AD 43, 4 Roman legions and numerous auxiliary cohorts invaded Britain and set about annexing this country as a province. Indeed, we were the last major province to join the empire. During the first 17 years, everything went according to plan. The Romans made Colchester their first provincial capital. They established London as a new town and a thriving commercial centre. Then, unexpectedly, while the provincial governor was campaigning in North Wales, a major uprising occurred, led by Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe. Eventually, that uprising was crushed. Boudica is now sitting over there. She has been charged, after some delay it must be said, with the offence of terrorism contrary to the 2000 Act. She has pleaded not guilty at the plea and directions hearing.
Court all rise.
Members of the jury, good evening and welcome to the Supreme Court. Tonight, members of the jury, Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, stands trial on charges stemming from her alleged involvement in the rebellion against the Roman government of Britannia in around CE 60. Boudica has been released from her plinth on Victoria Embankment for the duration of this trial. She sits before you in this courtroom, having made the short journey across Parliament Square, leaving her chariot behind. You'll be glad to hear that she also left her spear with the security staff, so that she comes unarmed to face this trial. You may think, members of the jury, that tonight's proceedings are unprecedented. You would be quite wrong. It is among the lesser known, although admittedly novel, functions of this court to hear proceedings in respect of an all-star cast of classical figures. Thus, in 2015, the assassins of Caesar were acquitted of his murder. In 2017, Antigone was absolved of breaking the law of Thebes, and in 2018, the extradition of Verres was ordered under a European arrest warrant. I should say something about the format of these proceedings. Ordinarily, in a criminal trial, you, the jury, would hear the cases advanced by the prosecution and the defense, consider all the evidence and decide whether you are sure that the prosecution has shown that the defendant is guilty. Now, that is the basic framework which you will apply in this trial, subject to a modification. You will not be able to consider all the evidence because, as I understand it, there is none. At any rate, no witnesses survive after a passage of some 2,000 years. But that may not be decisive, because the facts may well be broadly agreed by the parties. We shall see. However, I can give you an indication as to the contents of the indictment preferred against the accused. She stands charged with terrorism, contrary to Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000. in that she raised an army and led, instructed, and caused it to destroy 3 towns, including our present capital, Londinium, and to kill the inhabitants. You may hear submissions as to the applicable law used to interpret the Terrorism Act 2000. Is it classical Roman law? Celtic law as administered by the Druids of the Iceni? Or is it the modern law of England and Wales? At present, I don't know. I expect, however, that you will hear submissions on the applicable legal principles, and it may well be that the core of the dispute is as to how those apply to the facts. I would also mention that you are members of a self-selected jury, and I am given to understand that some of you may even have paid a fee to participate, albeit, of course, by way of donation to an excellent cause. Regardless, I must emphasize that you are to decide this case impartially and on the sole basis of the cases advanced on behalf of the parties. You must put out of your mind anything you may know about the case, which you have learned from the media, over the internet, or from memories of any ancient history syllabus. I should also say that before the start of any criminal trial, each member of the jury is asked whether they know the accused, and if so, they will be recused from any further service on the jury. Looking around, I don't consider this to be necessary, so that you're all impaneled to serve on the jury. You'll now hear submissions of 30 minutes approximately from each side, if everyone keeps to their time estimates, from Ms. Morgan QC and Ms. Isles for the prosecution, and from Mr. Grant QC and Mr. Morley for the defence. I will then sum up what we have heard, and you will vote by a show of hands as to whether the defendant is guilty of the charge brought against her. I will ask first those who find the defendant guilty to raise their hands, and then I will ask those who find the defendant not guilty to raise their hands. If she is guilty, then it will be my duty to impose some awful and fitting sentence to be endured by her before she returns to her plinth on the Victoria Embankment. If she's not guilty, then she will be at liberty, unscathed, to return to her plinth. So, members of the jury, I now put the accused into your charge. Her future is now in your hands, and I will invite Ms. Morgan to make her submissions on behalf of the prosecution.
Members of the jury, this is a prosecution brought on behalf of the Senate and the people of Rome against the defendant Boudica, who, as you have heard, is charged with being a terrorist within the meaning of Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000. Boudicca, the so-called warrior queen, the flame-haired saviour of Britannia. Do not believe the hype. Do not be fooled. Do not buy the Boudica memorabilia outside the Royal Albert Hall on the last night of the proms. Boudica was not a freedom fighter. She did not save this country. She undermined the very principles of security, governance, and sovereignty, which now underpin the freedoms that we enjoy today. She committed acts of mass murder and, more importantly, for your determination of the charge in this case, she did so acting as a terrorist. I must begin by saying that I am all in favour of a strong female figure. It is hard to walk past Thomas Thornycroft's statue of Boudica and her daughters near to Westminster Bridge, with Boudica standing aloft on her chariot, in her powerful, dominant pose, arm raised, without thinking that she was the first true proponent of girl power. Perhaps we should call her very scary Spice. But careful analysis reveals that Boudica is far from a role model. And here she is in miniature form. Here she is taken out of a tube which I've labelled governance. And I give her first place in my box, a box of terrorists. Now, in deference to the arguments that may be made on behalf of this defendant, I've also added in parentheses, freedom fighters. It is a distinction without difference when it comes to brutal acts of murder of the type that you are considering. Boudicca's terrorist activities in attacking and murdering civilians with obvious political and ideological purposes of seeking to undermine Roman rule, destroying the established cities of the Roman Empire, and intimidating citizens of those cities amounts to terrorism. But before I turn to the legal framework of the charge against her, let us examine the facts, and I begin with a bit of context. The bloodshed and brutality perpetrated by Boudicca in CE 60 does not reflect the history of relations between Boudicca's people and the Romans before that time. At the time of the Roman conquest in CE 43, Boudicca was 18 years old and married to King Presided, ruler of the Iceni people of East Anglia. However, 100 years or so earlier, long before Boudica, when Julius Caesar dipped his toe into Britannia in 55 and 54 BCE, the Iceni tribe could not get enough of him. Seeing their opportunity to improve their position in tribal disputes, they offered their allegiances to him at the drop of a hat. And that was doubtless because of the conspicuous benefits that came with better relationships with Rome. In the context of those ongoing tribal disputes, the Iceni watched as their southern neighbours grew rich from exporting all sorts of items to Rome: grain, cattle, irons, precious metals. And in return from Rome came all the best that Rome could offer: wine, olive oil, fine Italian pottery, all being shipped in. It was, if you like, an early forerunner to the Carluccio's restaurant chain. It is then little surprise that in that context, the Icenes felt that they were missing out and realised the benefits of brokering more positive relationships with Rome. Fast forward to 43 CE. Boudicca is married to the king and has children. Descriptions of her demeanour and appearance vary and are doubtless of questionable reliability. Cassius Dio described her as follows: she was very tall, the glance of her eye most fierce, her voice harsh. A great mass of the reddest hair fell down to her hips. Her appearance was terrifying. However, as is often the case for striking and empowered women, she came to be let down by the incompetence of her husband. It is impossible now to recreate the scenes of domestic turbulence that must have resulted on the day that Boudicca realised that her husband, the king, had decided that rather than leave his kingdom in total to her and their children, instead he would make the Emperor Claudius the co-heir to his kingdom and wealth. I am sure that separate bedrooms were slept in on that particular night. Whatever waves of domestic disharmony must have resulted from that announcement, the king had his reasons. In making the deal, he was endeavouring to secure the position of the Icenes in the context of the expanding Roman Empire, to cement their position within a framework of governance and security that the Roman Empire would seek to establish. Such a system would bring structure, protections, and benefits to the Icenes going forward. The sorts of benefits that underpin any system of government. Not necessarily a big society vision where everyone would benefit equally, of course, but a system of governance nonetheless. The King's choice in this regard is important. It may well have been that in entering into such an uncomfortable coalition, he displayed the type of limited foresight that would later be shown by Nick Clegg when placed in similar circumstances in a rose garden at the back of Downing Street in 2010. I doubt there was such an uncomfortable announcement of the awkward alliance in a staged meeting, but it may be the King justified his decision in similar terms to that given by Nick, who said at the time, while standing alongside Big Dave, "This is a new government and a new kind of government, a source of reassurance and stability at a time of great uncertainty in our country. We will have to show the skeptics who predict that it will go wrong that they are wrong." Well, the King too may have deluded himself as to the extent to which the Icenes would be equal partners to the Romans. But enter into a coalition he did, for the benefit of his kingdom and people, for the benefit of governance. On his death, it must be accepted that the Romans seized the moment in dramatic style and imposed themselves on the Icenes. That dominance may not have been the style of government that we would now wish for, although some may consider the purposeful determination, the ruthless efficiency, somewhat of a welcome contrast to the current climate. A system of governance was established. Britain was an imperial province of Rome. The governor represented the Emperor of Rome and exercised military as well as civil jurisdiction. The governor was supreme judge, hearing disputes between Roman citizens and those of high social rank. Finances were placed in the hands of the provincial procurator, an independent official who supervised revenue and taxation. Most detailed governance was devolved to local governments. There were civic units run by elected magistrates. They were responsible for resolving local disputes and collecting taxes and passing them on to the state. There are differing witness accounts as to what happened to Boudicca and her daughters following the death of the king. And you may well conclude that such conduct, even if it occurred, cannot be determinative of the charge in this case. Doubtless, if correct, that Boudica was attacked and flogged and her daughters raped, such actions cannot be defended, and I do not seek to do so. But that cannot justify an act of mass murder by way of revenge. It also seems that there may have been many complex and overlapping motives for the insurrection that followed. For example, anger at the Emperor Claudius, seeking to recover lump sums that had previously been paid out to the richest of Britons, resistance to the recovery of a loan plus interest given by Seneca, who lent the money to the islanders that in fact it seems they did not actually want, but then called in the loan on unfavourable terms. Well, let's be clear. If being angry about the unfair terms of a loan agreement could provide a proper justification for acts of mass murder, then we should all be fearful of the prevalence of the payday loans culture. But whatever indignities were inflicted upon her and her family members, they cannot begin to justify what followed. In CE 60 or 61, Boudica gathered an army to respond in anger against the Romans, to take up arms and to use violence to pursue her own political and ideological ends. She began by targeting a town that exemplified Roman rule, Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, a town for retired legionaries, in which each veteran was granted a homestead. The town gave the veterans a secure retirement. I imagine it to be akin to a gated community, with residents in their own flat, but with an on-call nurse available 24/7. No doubt the residents were enjoying planning the CE 60 equivalent of saga holidays, days spent on the golf course, catching up with the Archer's omnibus and relaxing with their friends at local bars. Well, that blissful existence was soon to be shattered. A rolling tide of hatred poured in, orchestrated by this defendant. Boudica and her army attacked the town, slaughtering everyone and anyone in their path, not confining themselves to attacking those who had directly wronged them. Accounts indicate individuals being hacked to death, women and children being killed, the streets running red with blood. No one was left alive. This was not a battle for strategic territory. It was an act of pure revenge, pursued for political and ideological reasons, seeking to undermine Roman governments and intimidating the public. From here, Boudica moved on to Londinium and Verulamium, killing, burning, desecrating cemeteries and artifacts. A total death toll of over 70,000 civilians. Vast amounts of damage was caused. Tens of thousands of lives were destroyed. Yet still, she carried on, eventually becoming the architect of the deaths of her own men and women in the Battle of Watling Street. Pushing on as she did led to the inevitable, albeit perhaps somewhat tardy, military engagement from the Romans. The insurrection was no match for the Romans, who were, by then, led by Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. 80,000 of this defendant's own people were led to their death in a resounding defeat. Her shame and defeat was such that she took lethal poison in an act of suicide to avoid capture. Well, as a result of those facts, by a miraculous suspension of reality, she's here with us today, and she appears before you charged with being a terrorist. So let us now consider what that means and apply, as I do, modern-day standards to her conduct. Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000 criminalises acts of serious violence designed to influence a government or to intimidate a section of the public pursued for the purpose of advancing a political or ideological cause. The use of this modern legislation to prosecute her actions is a reminder of the future importance of the principles that underpin this prosecution. Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the United States, and latterly star of the West End and Broadway shows of his own name, wrote this: "An insurrection, whatever may be its immediate cause, eventually endangers all government. Whatever the rights and wrongs pleaded in support of an insurrection, any insurrection, the effect of it is the same. It destabilizes the effectiveness of government and, in turn, the well-being of the people of that nation. It is for that reason that it is not for Boudica, or indeed any individual, to determine that it is her right to create such instability, to determine that it is his or her right to take the law into their own hands. Like it or not, her husband bequeathed control to the Romans. The Romans then established a system of governance in this country, and her actions were then the actions of insurrection against the functioning government in this country. In seeking to demonstrate why it is not up to any one individual to decide if and when it is right to take up arms against the state, I return to my box, the terrorist box. And Boudica is the first in that box. But let us consider some future examples of the importance of terrorist legislation. Next out of the tube of governance, an exceptional human being, a truly great man, Nelson Mandela. A man, however, who plotted armed insurrection against the government in South Africa, protesting against apartheid. Action pursued for what we would all properly consider to be the most laudable of causes. Few would wish to mount a case against Nelson Mandela. And plainly, there is no comparison between the violence inflicted at the hands of this defendant and that encouraged by Mr. Mandela. Well, next out of the tube of government, let's see who we've got. Che Guevara, the motorcycling, cigar-smoking poster boy for revolutionary students up and down the country. A guerrilla leader orchestrating a rebellion, viewed by some as a heroic revolutionary, but by others as a violent and murderous insurgent. So, the moral compass then becomes less clear-cut. Let's see who comes out next. Timothy McVeigh, a US domestic terrorist responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 that killed 168 people. A Gulf War veteran who sought to encourage a revolution against the federal government in the United States, defending his own bombing attack as a legitimate tactic against what he saw as a tyrannical government. Well, by now, the moral certainty of those so-called freedom fighters starts to look distinctly ill-founded. Let's go on to the next tube of governance and see who we've got in here. Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley Len, as he's actually known, a far-right, anti-Islam activist and convicted criminal who, in furtherance of his hatred of Muslims, committed an offence of contempt of court, seeking to undermine the justice system in this country by publishing a live stream of defendants entering a court building, whilst also calling out at them that they were Muslim child rapists, thereby seeking to jeopardise the fairness of the trial proceedings. And then the final individual within the tube, Jacob Anthony Chansley, the self-styled QAnon shaman, who was one of the ringleaders who stormed the Capitol building in Washington on the 6th of January 2021, in the aftermath of the election of Joe Biden. He was distinctive on the news footage from the time of the riots, probably see it on here, by his somewhat ridiculous fur hat and horns. He sought to undermine the democratic process and the election results, claiming that they, that is he and his little group, were patriots doing what our founding fathers would have done, and that the government was full of, quote, cowards who have no commitment to their country or their cause. So now our defendant finds herself sharing the freedom fighter box with all these individuals. If she is right in her ability to take up arms against the state, to use violence to impose her vision of freedom, then surely these individuals must all be right too. We might agree, we hope we would all agree, with the cause of Mr. Mandela. But what of Mr. McVeigh, Mr. Robinson, and the QAnon shaman? See, they've all left the safety and the security of these tubes of governance. They've all put themselves into a free-for-all. A free-for-all, mixing them up together in that box without any structure results in anarchy. The violence and bloodshed that would so obviously result from them acting in pursuit of what they all believe to be noble causes, all believing themselves to be freedom fighters, all rejecting the legitimacy of the government and sovereignty, and in so doing, all rejecting the protections that that governance brings with it. Who, you may ask, would be the sheriff in that particular town? Our courts have recognised that it cannot be permissible for an individual to take violent action against a state. In the case of F, the Court of Appeal considered a case involving a Libyan citizen charged with terrorism offences. The appellant claimed that his possession of documents of a kind likely to be useful to a person committing or preparing an act of terrorism had been justified on the basis that they had been passed to him by the leader of a resistance movement in Libya, opposed to the regime then headed by Colonel Gaddafi. The appellant relied upon evidence demonstrating that Gaddafi's tyrannical regime had targeted and murdered his associates. Well, the Court of Appeal considered the relationship between Section 1 of the Terrorism Act, that is to say the section that you are considering today, and the right to rebel against a tyrannous or unrepresentative regime. And defence submissions took the court to John Locke's observations in the Second Treatise of Government that the people were entitled to resume their original liberty when legislators sought to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power. The court then considered the meaning of government within Section 11B, in particular, whether that expression is limited to those countries which are governed by what may broadly be described as democratic or representative principles. The court observed this: no authority is needed for the proposition that democratic government, based on the consent of the people and the subject to the rule of law, is the lodestar for modern civilized communities. That, however, is far from saying that the only governments which can be included in legislation which provides for protection against terrorism are to be found in countries which adhere to the Convention or are governed in accordance with its principles. Section 1 does not specify that the ambit of its protection is limited to countries abroad with governments of any particular type or possessed of what we, with our fortunate traditions, would regard as the desirable characteristics of representative government. There is no list or schedule or statutory instrument which identifies the countries whose governments are included with Section 14D or excluded from the application of the Act. And the Court of Appeal continued as follows, and we would submit importantly. Finally, the legislation does not exempt, nor make exception, nor create a defence for, nor exculpate what some would describe as terrorism in a just cause. Such a concept is foreign to the Act. The Court of Appeal concluded, terrorism is terrorism, whatever the motives of its perpetrators. Well, I then invite you to look at the terms of the charge again. Boudica plainly used action involving serious violence. There may be little sensible dispute about that. It involved serious damage to property. It endangered the lives of many. It created risk to health and safety. And her action was plainly designed to influence the government and to intimidate the public or a section of the public. This was an act designed to influence the government of Rome into retreat and was intended to create fear within the Roman citizens. Her action was clearly and plainly for the purposes of advancing a political or ideological cause. There is no defence of being a freedom fighter. There is no defence of just cause. And the reason for that takes us back to our box of terrorists. In fact, I think I can hear some noises coming from in here. Yes, I can see. You see, what's going on in here is that Boudica and Nelson Mandela appear to be trying to set up a tribe on one side of the box. Yes, but someone else, calling him the QAnon shaman, keeps on breaking in and shouting about someone called Donald. Well, just hear Boudica. What's she saying now? Ah, yes, she wants to go back in the tube now, so we'll just put her back in there. Hardly surprising, you may think. Who is to decide which noble cause is the right one. Anyone who commits violence of the type set out in Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000 for political or ideological reasons, seeking to destabilise the government or to intimidate the public, is a terrorist, no matter what you may think of their politics or ideology. In the case of Jones before the Committee of the House of Lords in 2006, Lord Hoffman observed that a tight control of the use of force is necessary to prevent society from sliding into anarchy. He quoted from Hobbes, Leviathan, chapter 13, who described such anarchy as the state of nature which, in quotes, men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of this earth, no navigation, no use or commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and what is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man? Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. When you look inside that box, you see that anarchy unfolding. On behalf of the prosecution, members of the jury, we invite you to convict this defendant. In returning a guilty verdict, you acknowledge the outrageous acts of violence that this defendant orchestrated. But of even greater importance, you acknowledge the fundamental principle that lies behind Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000. It protects us all from serious violence perpetrated because one individual considers that they are entitled to take action by force in support of their own particular cause. Terrorism is terrorism, whatever the motives of the perpetrator. Thank you, my Lord.
Friend Mr. Edward Merley, on behalf of Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, who sits proudly before you. I'm going to stand aside so you can cast your eyes upon her. Who sits proudly before you, accused of being a terrorist. Now, it'll be our submissions this evening that we hope to demonstrate to you that this prosecution is not only misconceived, but it is the worst example of victor's justice. Now, myself and Mr. Merley are going to divide up our submissions. I'm going to deal with three issues. I'm going to say some words about my client. I'm going to say some words about the historical backdrop to this prosecution. And you've heard my learned friend setting out a wholly partial account of Roman occupation between 43 AD and now 61 CE. I'm going to try and dispel that partial account. Thirdly, I'm going to say a few things about the Act of Parliament under which this prosecution is brought and under which my client is charged. And my learned friend Mr. Merley will then deal with the uprising itself, so-called, and our client's role within it. Now, one thing, members of the jury, is clear. The Romans have routed the brave British resistance. I must concede that. And these Romans now stand masters of this island. But not content with their victory, they now seek to punish this brave woman, who I confidently predict will, in the centuries that follow this year, CE 61, will become an icon of what may become known in years to come as concepts perhaps unknown to you or alien to you now in 61 CE, but perhaps will become more fashionable in years to come, an icon of anti-imperialism, an icon of anti-colonialism. But before I go any further, I want to say something more about Boudica. You may have read scurrilous Roman propaganda written about her. I have read on my tablet, I mean my stone tablet, which of course we can buy from any newsagent in this land, the following words. And my learned friend quoted them, or quoted a few of these words. They derive from a Roman historian, or so-called historian, more like a propagandist. And I quote, "In stature she was tall, in appearance most terrifying. In the glance of her eye most fierce, and her voice was harsh." What relevance do you think, members of the jury, it was to make reference to the harshness of her voice, other than to do her down? Around her neck was a large golden necklace, and she wore a tunic of divers colours, over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This was her invariable attire. She grasped a spear to aid her in terrifying all beholders. Members of the jury, do not believe anything or everything that you have read on your tablet. Look at my client. Look at her. Was there ever a face less fierce and an appearance less terrifying? And members of the jury, I see no spear. This may be a Roman courthouse, and I acknowledge it is built with typical Roman ingeniousness and sturdiness. But members of the jury, you are British born, and Boudicca, mild and gentle Boudicca, is content to place her fate in your hands, confident that a British jury will do justice to a Briton who, as we will endeavour to demonstrate, took up arms against a foreign and colonial invader which threatened with menace and rapacity every British-born citizen. Before I come to the charges against Boudica, let me take you back in time. It is now, of course, CE 62. But members of the jury, and I see some greybeards among you, you are not forgetful of the events of these last 2 decades. 20 years ago, this was a peaceful nation, or should I say, set of nations. We kept ourselves to ourselves. We didn't holiday abroad on the continent. We lived harmoniously. Then, on that terrible day in CE 43, came Claudius, Emperor of Rome, and his fearsome legionaries. Now let us be clear. What Claudius did in 43 AD was an act of war and an act of illegal invasion. It was illegal by reference to any legal system the world over. And I hope that in years to come, perhaps in many centuries to come, there will be formed and developed some sort of United Nations which will gather together to prevent and sanction the aggression of one nation against another. Perhaps, members of the jury, that notion will, in some far distant future, gain ground. Sadly, it is not with us now. But what right, I ask, did those Romans have to violate our sovereignty? I waited in vain for my learned friend to offer any form of explanation, legitimizing or explaining or justifying that invasion. They had none. They had none, and as each and every one of you in this courtroom will know, this country and its people have for the last 18 years writhed under the terrible yoke of this illegal occupation. Members of the jury, if you were ever tempted to ask the question, what have the Romans ever done for us? I have a clear answer. Yes, I accept we now have cobbled roads which run straight and allow us to travel freely across the country. Yes, I accept that we have aqueducts delivering clean water. I accept we have markets selling tempting choice goods. I accept that new building and agricultural techniques have made day-to-day life more tolerable for all of us. But apart from that, members of the jury, putting all that to one side, I ask again, what have the Romans ever done for us? And the answer must be, surely, members of the jury, nothing, and worse than nothing. Everyone in this courtroom will have his or her own story to tell about the last 18 years of Roman occupation. But I wish to tell briefly Boudicca's story, because it is a story to break your hearts, members of the jury. As you know, Boudicca was wife of proud king Prasutagas of the Iceni, and this peaceful king did everything he could to appease these Romans. My learned friend has suggested some kind of willful act of parleying and trading with the Romans, as if the Iceni was standing on equal footing with the Romans. We know the truth, members of the jury. Prasutagas did everything he could to try to prevent and stymie Roman rapacity. So when he died, he left his estates, yes, he left his estates to the Emperor Nero and to his and Boudicca's daughters. But this was no marital tiff, as my learned friend suggested. This was Prasutagas intending and hoping and praying that after he had died, he could preserve somehow the sanctity and peacefulness of his nation. It was a desperate attempt to protect his people from Roman greed and aggression. What was the Roman response, members of the jury? Well, we all know. It was to confiscate lands, to impoverish the people, to treat them with casual contempt. They even built a temple in Camalodunum, Colchester as now is, to their emperor Claudius. To build a temple to a man who just died and has now been deified? What an act of sacrilege that was. Indeed, what an act of vulgarity that was. Perhaps in future years, the county of Essex will itself be associated with white marble buildings and false Corinthian columns. If it is, it'll be all down to what the Romans did in Camalodunum when they built this ghastly temple to Claudius. Now, even a man called Tacitus, a so-called Roman historian, who has no love for our people, has written about what happened and about what his own countrymen did. And let me quote from him. That the Romans drove people out of their houses, ejected them from their farms, called them captives and slaves. And another so-called historian, Cassius Dio, whom my learned friend has made reference to, has himself written that having forced upon we Britons unwanted loans and unwanted monies at appalling interest rates, after Prasutagas died, what was the response? It was to demand the money back in full and then to take severe measures in seeking to exact it. And what did my client do? She made mild protest. What was the Roman response? Well, my learned friend has been forced to concede what the Roman response was. It was to cruelly beat Queen Boudica and to violate her two daughters. So when Boudicca's people rose up in the face of these provocations, members of the jury, can you find it in your heart, yours and yours and yours and yours, to blame her or to blame them? Was this not the only conceivable response to the outrages perpetrated by these Roman occupiers and colonialists? Now, I want to now turn, if I may, to the charge laid against Boudicca. She is accused of terrorism, and each of you have in your hands the indictment that is laid against her. It is said that she was a terrorist, contrary to Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000. Now, I want to say a few things about this Terrorism Act. It defines terrorism at Section 1 as follows. And let me read out a few of the lines and words of that section. In this act, terrorism means the use or threat of action where. And then there are three subparts, A, B, and C. A, the action falls within subsection 2. I'm going to come back to subsection 2 to set out the kind of acts that are said to be terrorism. B, the second element of the act and the offence, the use or threat is designed to influence the government or to intimidate the public or a section of the public. So that is the second element of the offence charged against my client. And thirdly, C, the use or threat, that is of the action, is made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial or ideological cause. Those are the three elements. Let me briefly turn to the types of action which can constitute terrorism. So subsection 2 says action falls within this subsection if it A, involves serious violence against a person, B, involves serious damage to property, C, endangers a person's life other than that of the person committing the action, or D, creates a serious risk to the health or safety of the public or a section of the public. And my learned friends rely on all four of those parts of subsection 2. There is a fifth subsection, or a fifth type of action, which potentially can be terrorism. And it is this, I quote, is designed seriously to interfere with or seriously to disrupt an electronic system. Now, even the ingenuity of my learned friends, and their ingenuity knows no bounds, even that ingenuity has not allowed them to assert that Boudicca has managed to disrupt any of Rome's electronic systems. Indeed, standing here in 62 CE, I have no idea what electronic systems are. Perhaps what the act refers to is the power of our wise druids to control lightning. But that is not relied upon, members of the jury. That is not relied on against Boudica. Now, there are four things that I wish on behalf of my client to say about this act and its so-called applicability to our client. The first is that this is an act of Parliament which, members of the jury, you should not recognise. Did you vote for the Parliament that created this harsh law? Of course you didn't. This is law imposed by imperial fiat. And I suggest to you, members of the jury, that the only proper law is the law that derives from a legitimate source. And here there is no legitimate source. By what right, I ask you, members of the jury, have these Romans to impose their so-called laws upon us without any form of popular mandate? And I say the answer is clear. There is no right, none at all. And I ask you to note the terms of the indictment. You have it in front of you. Who is bringing this prosecution? I quote, the Senate and people of Rome. What right have those people, hundreds of miles away in Rome, to speak to us, to say that this woman is a criminal or not a criminal? And I may add one footnote to that first submission that I make. There is in this land an ancient Celtic principle, which is a principle that says one cannot criminalize behavior retrospectively. I can't do a thing on Monday and then a parliament comes along on Wednesday and says we are treating that thing as criminal. No, one can only criminalize conduct prospectively. Now, I look at this indictment and I see that this act is dated 1,940 or so years hence. Was it in force in AD 62? I think not. My learned friends made no submission to that effect. I accept, perhaps, that is an argument which brings within it too many metaphysical complications for this trial, so I will leave that submission where it is and move on to my second submission, and that is that you will have noticed the reference in this act, as I have laid it out to you, to acts designed to influence the government. And indeed, one sees in my learned friend's indictment that very phrase, to influence the government of Rome, the third last line of the indictment. The government of Rome. Now, this act, this imperialist act, apparently extends, so I am told by my learned junior, to any government in the world. It is therefore a very far-reaching act. But I suggest to you that it must be given some sensible boundary. Whatever Boudicca did or did not do, and Mr. Merli will deal with that, she had no interest at all in the government of Rome. She knows nothing about Rome. All she knows about is the government of this country, or should I say, the so-called government of this country. Because my next and second submission is that this act must refer to a lawful government. And my learned friend made a submission concerning a case called F, concerning the Libyan government. But what she did not say and could not say is that the act has to engage in a government which is lawful. Whether or not it's democratic is another matter. It has to be a legitimate and lawful government. And I suggest to you, members of the jury, that this so-called government is no such thing. It is ruled by force, not ruled by consensus. It is ruled by naked force, and therefore this government cannot be treated as a government for the purpose of this act. The third thing, my members of the jury, that I say to you is that you will have noted from the indictment that my client is accused of having as her purpose the advancement of a political or ideological cause, and that is an absolute prerequisite to a charge of terrorism. What is the cause? Again, you pick up your indictment and you see it right at the end, namely Iceni dissidence and secession. Members of the jury, the land of the Iceni is a sovereign kingdom. Boudicca was attempting to secede from nothing. The uprising, which was so brutally crushed, as Mr. Merli will explain, was no act of secession, but an act of self-defense. It was not ideological. It was not political. The uprising was motivated by something far, far deeper. It was the desire to live peacefully and unmolested by Roman aggression. And I suggest to you, what other queen, what self-respecting queen could have done anything different to what she did in the circumstances she found herself in? I come now to my fourth and final point. What Boudicca is alleged to have done is not terrorism. It has a simple description. It is war. A soldier in a war is no criminal, and nor is a general in a war. Still less is that general or soldier a terrorist. Boudicca is an honourable warrior, and she is an honourable warrior having to face the bitter pill of defeat. And as Mr. Merli will show you, throughout this war, Boudicca acts with conspicuous honour and propriety. My learned friend has shown you various tennis balls. I ask you, members of the jury, to pick up your metaphorical racket and volley them out of this court one, not of Wimbledon, but of the Supreme Court. I ask you to deliver a resounding verdict of not guilty to this put-upon woman. Thank you so much, members of the jury. My learned friend, Mr. Merli, will follow.
Members of the jury, I want to address you on two matters, which in our submission lead to the inescapable conclusion that you must acquit Boudicca of the charges laid against her. First, I want to explore with you what the historical accounts say about the use of fear on either side of the battlefield. You will learn that it was not Boudicca, but Rome which sought to weaponize terror in pursuit of its questionable political objectives. Second, I want to look at the evidence that there is as to what Boudicca actually did and what she was responsible for in relation to the events in Colchester, London, and St Albans. Members of the jury, you have heard submissions about the Terrorism Act and how that seeks to define terrorism. In your deliberations, however, you must not abandon common sense. You will be familiar with the well-known elephant test. It's hard to define an elephant, but you'll recognize it when you see it, especially if it's coming over the Alps. Terrorism, likewise, is characterized more by recognition than definition. It is the weaponization of fear for illegitimate ends, contrary to the public good. Well, members of the jury, let us examine the evidence, such as it is, about what Boudica and this Roman general Suetonius Paulinus said at the time. The contrast is striking. Before taking any action, according to Dio, Boudica made a prayer. In it, she praised the valor of the British and commented on how women and men were treated equally and possess equal excellence. Her prayer is then for three things: victory, the preservation of life, and liberty. Is that the prayer of a terrorist, members of the jury? Does a terrorist pray for the preservation of life? And next comes the speech of Paulinus, the Roman general, who, let's not forget, members of the jury, was late to this party because he was off butchering the miserable inhabitants of Anglesey for reasons that to this day remain unclear. According to Dio, in his speech to his troops, Paulinus says this, and I quote, "By this one battle, you will both make your present possessions secure and subdue whatever remains." So in other words, members of the jury, you can hang on to your current booty and plunder the rest. And he continues, "For everywhere our soldiers, even though they are in other lands, will emulate you, and your foes will be terror-stricken." He goes on to exhort Romans to rule over all of mankind. So there you have it, members of the jury. Two things will have struck you. The first is the Roman general's obsession with getting rich and plundering. And that is all the Roman government in Britain really amounted to, as their rapacious occupation of the British Isles bore testament. But the second point is this. The Roman general is saying, use violence, use killing, use the danger to life and the destruction of property. Use all this to terrorize all of your political opponents all over the world. So on the one hand, members of the jury, we have a female leader praying for the preservation of life, a champion of freedom, of equality. And on the other hand, we have a general encouraging his soldiers to get rich quick by plundering the native population and terrorizing others in the dubious name of Roman imperial ambition, a political cause or ideology that includes the subjugation of the entirety of mankind. Which is the terrorist, members of the jury? We say the answer is clear. And if it wasn't clear, members of the jury, let me remind you what happened next, what happened after the battle. The Romans went on not only to kill the soldiers who fought, but also the innocent women who had come along to watch the home crowd. It is hard to imagine a more heinous crime. How is that not an act of terrorism on the part of Rome, designed, as the general said, to strike terror into the hearts of Rome's adversaries and the people of Britain? Who will answer for that crime? And does this not demonstrate, members of the jury, the total illegitimacy of the Roman occupation of Britain? This was not government of a people, but a rapacious imperial tyranny set on self-enrichment at the expense, enslavement, and murder of the local population. The second matter I want to consider with you, members of the jury, is the actual role played by Boudicca herself. When we talk of the Iceni, we are talking really about Norfolk. And Tacitus makes clear that there are a number of, and the word he uses is praecipui, leading men among the Iceni. Let's call them the Norfolk nobles. Now, these Norfolk nobles were also severely and cruelly mistreated by Rome. It's clear that this was not just a single kingdom. Boudica, as you've heard, was not even named as heir of her late husband's will. So she has no formal status, really, within the local government of the Iceni. And looking very closely at the account of Tacitus, who undoubtedly is the more reliable, we see that after the reference he gives to the beating of Boudica and the rape of her daughters, there is then a reference to these Norfolk nobles, and then a plural verb, rapiant armour. They seized arms. No suggestion here that Boudicca incited rebellion or insurrection, simply that her hideous treatment at the hands of Rome was the cause of the uprising of these nobles of Norfolk. And Tacitus makes no reference at all to Boudicca during the description he gives of the subsequent events to which this charge relates. And that's hardly surprising. Boudicca no longer has a clear position among the Iceni themselves, but more importantly, the attacks in Colchester, in London, and in St Albans are all outside the jurisdiction of the Iceni. Furthermore, the start of the insurrection in Colchester, which must surely have been orchestrated by the local tribes in Essex, is described by Tacitus with an ablative absolute. And good luck, members of the jury, trying to extract the identity of any instigator out of that grammatical contortion. But the natural inference from the context must surely be this: it is the leading men, these Norfolk nobles, who have just so recently taken up arms, who, if anyone, are the inciters. And Tacitus then simply refers to the barbarians, plural, acting without any reference to any leadership or incitement on the part of Boudicca. The next reference to Boudicca that Tacitus gives is simply as leader of a military force engaging the Romans on a battlefield. And no charge is levelled against her by the prosecution for those actions. And the accounts of her speech before battle portray her as anything but a terrorist. She stands for liberty, for equality, for the unity of Britain. That she failed is largely down to geography. Tacitus himself mentions not one single act on the part of Boudicca that is unbecoming or unjustified. It is fair to say that Dio does say that Boudicca was responsible for leading the war, but that is not inconsistent, members of the jury, with her leading the final battle. And in Dio's evidence, Paulinus refers in his speech to the troops, refers to the attacks by the British, and he says this. He says, "You've heard, and some of you have seen, what these kataratoi have done, these hateful men." The masculine plural ending tells you everything you need to know. Paulinus himself does not blame Boudicca for these attacks. So, members of the jury, in your deliberations, you'll have to weigh up two things. On the one hand, we have a woman standing up to the systemic and widespread physical and financial mistreatment suffered by all Britons at the hands of Rome. A woman who prays for the preservation of life. A woman who champions sexual equality and the right of women to be free from male violence. All these universal human virtues that must be jealously safeguarded. And on the other hand, you have a rotten and illegitimate Roman government characterized in 5 words: conquest, enslavement, avarice, rape, plunder. Tacitus has acquitted Boudicca, and so has Dio, and so, members of the jury, must you. The historians blame the broken Roman system. The whole system is so rotten that I wager, members of the jury, that it will be less than 10 years before even the Romans themselves rise up in arms against the hateful Emperor Nero. In a sentence, then, if the government isn't fit, you must acquit. Thank you, members of the jury.
Well, I'm sure, members of the jury, that you have been greatly informed by those submissions that have been made, the highest standards of advocacy. I suppose at this stage it's normal for a judge to give you directions as to the law and to provide you with a summary of the evidence. However, that's not going to occur because this is a short trial, and I think that all those decisions are definitely for the jury. What have the Romans ever done for us? Aqueducts, roads, wine. Peace was the last thing that they suggested, but of course that's an issue because they're portrayed as plundering, dominant, enslavement, rapacious, grasping imperial force. So, the essential issue is whether Boudicca is a freedom fighter or a terrorist. If a freedom fighter acting in a war of self-defense of her sovereign rights and of her family and of her tribe, then it is suggested that she is not guilty. despite what is suggested as a somewhat disproportionate response of slaughtering 70,000 people and laying waste to 3 towns. But if she is a terrorist, then of course she is guilty. So it remains to be seen which is your verdict. And I will now proceed to ask those who would convict Boudicca to raise their hands. There we are. We have a total of 3 or 4, I think. We've got a surprise. 5. And those who would acquit Boudicca. Well, there we have it. A very large number. So, it's my duty now, Your Majesty. You have been found not guilty of terrorism, and you are at liberty to return to your plinth with your chariot, with your horses and spear, and without any stain on your character, and remain as a national symbol of an inspirational hero. That now concludes the trial.
Congratulate very warmly all 4 counsel on their excellent presentations this evening. And may I also thank Lord Stevens, our judge tonight, for conducting this trial so admirably. I hope that everyone who is in this courtroom, and the very much larger number of people who are watching us online, have enjoyed the occasion. This mock trial is one of many events which Classics for All puts on, not only to provide entertainment, but also in the course of raising funds for its charitable purpose, which is to promote and fund the teaching of classics in state schools, both primary and secondary. Classics for All has been in existence now for about 11 years. It has reached some 1,200 schools, and I'm told by the Classics for All office that in the course of this year alone, it has trained some 800 teachers who desire to teach Latin or Greek or classical civilization. So this is a very active and a very worthwhile charity. The lawyers group is just one group within it. If any lawyers who are present here today or watching online are not members of the lawyers group, I hope that you will consider joining us, because, as I say, we support a very worthwhile cause, and in addition to that, the events which we put on are of a very high standard, educational, entertaining, and informative. So I thank everyone who has attended today in person, and I thank everyone who has tuned in online to watch the proceedings, and that now concludes the live streamed part of this process.